Eldar is a great speaker, and we're very privileged to have him. Eldar Marcussen, his talk title is The Defender's New Clothes, so please welcome Eldar to the stage.
G'day, Canberra. Can you hear me out the back? Right, here today to talk about the Defender's New Clothes. Some might recognise that title. It's based on a fairy tale that I remember from my childhood about a vain emperor who gets swindled by these two guys who convince him that they can make magic clothes. And the magic property of these clothes is that only intelligent people can see them. And they're not actually providing clothes, they're just pretending. But no one wants to call out the fact that the emperor isn't wearing any clothes because they don't want to be seen as low intellect. Until he has a parade and one day a small child says, oh look, the emperor isn't wearing any clothes, and then the illusion fades and everyone can see that he's naked. And I chose this bit of street art to help illustrate this, where it's more he's walking around with a big cash suitcase. And I want to draw sort of a bit of a parallel between this story and how we maybe view the defensive solutions we use to protect data and networks, computers, etc. So when I say the Defender's New Clothes, the clothes is essentially the solutions that we implement. Defender is anyone who has an obligation or a desire to protect data systems using these solutions. And so here are some of the examples, right? We have firewalls, we have web application firewalls, access controls, antivirus, etc. And so I want to talk a little bit about how maybe we put too much trust in these systems. Some of the things that people often don't consider when we talk about defensive solution is the level of privileged access they often have, right? Your antivirus might be running in kernel space. Things like effectiveness can be hard to measure, so we might have to just take it on blind trust that it works. We've seen recently that a lot of security software have had CVEs and remotely exploitable bugs in them. So how do we know how secure the supply chain development practices of the software is? We kind of fall back on trust. So you might want to ask yourself, what's something on your network that basically has access to everything, right? You might have a Nessus box that has every VLAN truncated to that box. If that box were to be popped, you have a flat network. A great question that I'd like to bring up is, how do you measure the effectiveness of your web application firewall? I have not yet heard a good answer. If you think you have a good methodology for measuring how effective your WAF is, please have a chat to me after. I'd really like to hear some different approaches. And like I said, we put in security solutions or software in privileged positions. How do we then secure these solutions? And I am going to get a little bit snarky today. I might call out some specific vendors. It doesn't mean that all their solutions are bad. Your mileage may vary. A great example from pen testing, and we're working in consulting, we'd go in, we do an internal pen test, we find that the management interface of your network switches, your email gateway, etc., that's all available on the internal network as opposed to under its own management LAN, and very often we'd find them with default credentials. So, you go out, you buy an expensive piece of security software, don't change the default credentials, those security controls don't work at that point, right? That's sort of why it's important to not just go, oh, it's solution X, we are secure, but rather think about this problem a bit differently. So I want to start with a story. of a pen test where we were going up against some defenses. The story basically goes like this. Remote hacker wants to get into the juicy data that's sitting on the website, and there's a WAF in the middle, right? So the hacker might not be able to get in because security. At this point, WAF bypass it, like for those who don't know, you can take like the fav icon, MD5 hash it, look it up on Showdown, and like access the server directly as opposed to going through the WAF. Not a case here. But before I get into the story, there's a couple of things that I want to cover that I don't really have a good segue for. So I'm just going to drop them in here a little bit awkwardly. So first I want to talk about access control, and I don't really have anything related to this, but it's something I found very recently. And the reason why it's interesting is because I'm going to show you a little trick. And this little trick will basically get all of you, everyone in this room who knows this trick, will instantly achieve APT status, nation-level hacking capability, from this one trick. I kid you not. And I found this when I'm looking at this AWS load balancer that was trying to prevent access to the documentation for an API. So behind the load balancer, there sits a container or a web server, whatever, that has the documentation for the API on the web server. And it's meant to be there to be accessed by internal systems, but not through the internet. So the load balancer is the gateway between the internet and the container. And so we want to block access to this specific URL. And so we see here it's doing a text pattern. If the URL is API docs, return a 401. You're not allowed to access this. Okay. So this is what happens. You go to the domain.example.com/API docs, you get a 401. But then you're like, well, it's text matching. What if we make it a little bit different but same? You get a 200 OK. And that is the trick. This is what I call the power of slash. I might say this a couple of times through this presentation. I might try to get you guys involved. So when I yell power of slash, you can yell power of slash back. How about that? Right. So that's like this one trick, and we'll come back to this trick. The next thing that I kind of wanted to cover is sort of WAFs and some of the more advanced techniques, or in ways in which WAFs are not necessarily effective because it's relevant to this story. So a great WAF bypass is base64 encoding. Right? And whether that's an intentional feature, because sometimes people have functionality that clashes with WAF rules, and the solution is just base64 encode it, sail straight through. We've seen that a few times, that just people base64 encode something, you then have a payload, add the SQL injection, and it just works. One of the negative things with this is you'd like your WAF to block, OWASP top 10. And one of the things on OWASP top 10 is object injection or insecure deserialization. And serialized data is almost always base64 encoded. So that's like a whole category of OWASP top 10 that the WAF just goes too hard. It's a feature we can't get rid of. I'm not entirely sure. And even if it did base64, NetSpooky recently released this base64 encoding mutation that manipulates the sequence of bits that you're encoding to invoke padding in the base64. So all the bits of base64 you see down in the corner there, they all decode to NetSpooky, but they're different. So that's also not something I've seen in use, but it's a nifty thing, and it might get you past some controls in the future. So, besides base64, there's another OWASP top 10 that you'd like your WAF to block. Cross-site scripting, right? Everyone's favorite web bug. Pops up some alert boxes or steals a session. Because JavaScript is Turing complete, if you're injecting into a JavaScript session, there is literally nothing the WAF can do to block you writing some incomprehensible code that actually executes JavaScript. So the one I've been using, and I guess I should say this, probably my biggest regret with giving this talk is that most of the things I'm going to show will probably be ineffective within a month, right? So I'm going to have to come up with some new techniques. So I use fragmentation, where I assign an object into a variable and then use that variable, and the usual sort of keyword matching doesn't happen. I break up a string into multiple write operations, right-side, cross-site scripting. Also, Robin recently published this idea of split XSS that uses multiline comments to manipulate multiple injection points into sort of a running comment from within an injected point into another injected point. It's pretty good. You should check that out. I'll also come back to this technique a bit later. And like I said, Turing complete, Unicode friendly. You can encode JavaScript in all manner of things. So here we have a cuneiform Unicode encoded JavaScript. And yeah, you can't exactly text filter for this stuff. Now, there are some that are saying things like langsec, and they'll have automatically detection of which language you're injecting, etc., and that's going to be the next generation. I haven't had a chance to play with it, but I'm pretty sure you can write a Ruby/JavaScript/HTML/GIF polyglot string and get around that sort of stuff anyway. So yeah, that's sort of the pretext. Not directly relatable, but gives you sort of an understanding of how I think about WAFs in particular, because like I do a lot of web stuff. So back to the story. Testing this website, I find a directory traversal. And now you might say, but Eldar, it's a WAF. It blocks directory traversal. And sometimes. There's a couple of things that WAFs generally can't block very well. The first one is relative traversal. The reason why they can't block relative traversal very well is because having a /index.php or /robot.txt as a parameter can be valid. Like if you have a logout URL that does a redirect, that could be a valid argument. So it's kind of hard to block that. The one I didn't expect to work was the non-traditional traversal. That just sailed right past. I'm like, okay, well, I would have expected that someone had written slightly better rules. Multi-part traversal, where you have multiple parameters being concatenated into one string, I don't think we'll ever be able to detect from like a WAF perspective, because the context is so specific to the individual page. But I just wanted to show you that I'm not lying, right? So here we have Cloudflare with, like, there's no vulnerability here, right? You just put random parameters in the query string and it goes, well, I'm a WAF and I'm seeing something that I consider malicious, I'm going to block it, regardless of what the back-end functionality is. So we do .. hits the password and goes, no, that's a traversal, you're not allowed. I said, okay, well, what if I add the power of slash? The power of that, yeah. He said, yeah, sure. Go ahead, read my files. And again, picking on Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a $500 million a year revenue company. I would think that they could hire maybe someone to try to bypass the run rules for a small amount of money compared. Whether they actually do that and it just wasn't effective in this case, I'm not sure. But I would like to think that when you're paying a lot of money for security, you actually get some security. So of course this was interesting and fun, and wrote a tool to do this. Travesty. I forgot to hit push on GitHub. I'll do that after my talk. So this afternoon, that'll be up. So now we can leak the files. Primarily we were doing the relative traversal, reading the source code, we identify LFI. But we don't have a file to include. Okay, well, we can't just upload like a PHP shell because the WAF says no. So we look around to find some other exploit primitives, if you want to call it that. We'll find that one of the pages, it writes user data to a log file. It has file rotation, so that's very handy because if you mess up, like you say that you're trying to inject piece by piece, and then it blocks like one of them, and then now your code isn't your code anymore because you're missing a chunk. Being able to have that file rotated out so you get a clean injection slate, super handy. Very, very happy that they had that feature. It's browser accessible, so we could also access the log file directly and verify what we injected to see whether or not something gets encoded, etc. But you can't just go and slap a PHP string in there because the WAF says no. So we come back to one of the things that I talked about earlier, code fragmentation. If the WAF can't see the entirety of your code, but rather just little parts that once in the log file becomes the whole, it probably won't block the individual parts. And again, it seems to be sort of keyword operated, so you want to make sure that you avoid the keywords if you can. In this case, we couldn't just do like line by line because there was a bunch of stuff in between. But independently of Robin, we also came up with this idea of multiline comments. And turns out, upon closer research, that there's more than a handful of people that have independently discovered this technique in the past, but I'm the first one that I'm aware of that used it for PHP. So we basically injected something like this. And you see at the start, we start a PHP in between like all the user agent data and stuff. And then we start a multiline, because PHP doesn't care about anything that's outside of the PHP tags. And then the multiline says that anything in between multilines within this PHP tag, spanning multiple lines, is to be ignored. So then we end the multi-line comment, insert a keyword, start another multi-line comment. And then that way, sort of work our way down, and we get a web shell injected into the log. Again, kind of tedious, so we wrote a tool. This one is live on GitHub. And basically, it takes a bit of PHP code, applies some generic rules to split it out into little chunks that shouldn't ideally trigger WAFs, although I'm kind of surprised it didn't block the base64 decode, but it didn't. And then fed this in piece by piece. So now I have a traversal, I have a local file include, I've got a file that I control the content of the web server, I can eval code, because that's what I uploaded. I didn't upload like a web shell, I just gave it generic eval. So now I can base64 encode a blob and have that running. But there's a problem. I can run PHP code, but I can't like access system resources that well, and I can't run commands because the sysadmin had applied hardening. So these are the actual functions that were blocked on the box. And this is actually more comprehensive. If you go out and you Google PHP hardening, they'll give you a different list that is equally ineffective. But it's different. So they've gone really hard on like no commands, right? Like they've even disabled escape shell arg and escape shell command, which are safety features, not command execution. Okay. So at this point, I sort of imagine that this is what the sysadmins thought would happen, right? There's a WAF, there's hardening, the hacker comes along, and then, oh no. But that's not what actually happened, right? We're going to hack the planet. Because what happens is at each step of this journey, I'm getting closer and closer to code execution, running commands. Like, if I were going to walk away, I'd probably walk away at the first hurdle, not like the fifth, because I'm this close, right? You can taste it. So there's a bunch of useful PHP functions that they haven't disabled, right? They disabled rename and chmod, but if I can file open and unlink and umask, I have all that functionality. I just have to do more than one operation. So we can sidestep hardening, because the PHP hardening only applies to PHP, and this is a Linux system with many other options. So I chose to go with one that's very near and dear to my heart. I wrote out a htaccess-based web shell that executes commands through server-side includes, because PHP hardening doesn't apply to server-side includes. But the WAF is being difficult yet again. I can't access htaccess files directly from the browser because the WAF says, no, that's not allowed. But that's okay. We can curl exec to localhost from a base64 encoded LFI, which has a base64 encoded payload through to... You get the idea. So we win. We have code execution, but we still want more, right? Running commands isn't enough. Like we want root. So run PS. Notice that there's this PHP script that keeps running as root pretty regularly, so I'm guessing cron job. Funnily enough, there's a directory called crontab, which has the same file name in it. Yeah, seems legit. Unfortunately, chmod 777, so I can just append a bit of code to it, dump etc shadow to temp Eldar was here, crack the passwords, and then find the person responsible for the box so that they can fix this stuff. And that's sort of the end of the security, or the story, not the end of the security. And you might say, is this effective security? We've invested a lot of money in the WAF, in the hardening, monitoring. Actually, CrowdStrike was running on the box at the time. It wasn't included in the report they provided to us. Turns out that someone had marked this as pen testing. I guess because it said TMP Eldar was here. No one asked me, are you doing this? So it's probably a human failure process at this point. But yeah, it's hard to say whether or not it's effective. Sure, I triggered some alerts in that process, right? But then the question is, what happens? Do they IP ban me? Do they actually resolve the vulnerabilities quicker than I can get a new IP and get back up to the stage that I was at? Because I wrote tools, so this is like automated at this point. Getting back to where I was takes 5 minutes. But that's sort of the end of, I guess, WAF and web security and hardening. Your mileage might vary. So for the next part, I wanted to look at some other areas of security, like detection and antivirus and whatnot. And before I get into that, I wanted to share 2 statements from Twitter, the infinite pool of wisdom and knowledge. Dave Atel tweeted this at the start of this year, and for me, this statement really resonates. I feel like this is true based on my own experience. That a lot of people on the defensive side, he specifically says incident response, seems to think that attackers aren't very clever or good. The flip side, which I guess kind of confirms this, was a discussion with Malware Tech. And I got to be fair to Marcus, this is out of context. We were talking about whether or not people should release proof of concept exploits, rather than specifically whether or not the skill gap is that high. But the essence of this is what he's saying is that there's so many state actors or non-state actors that can't do like even simple hacking, right? It's all just copy-paste or using somebody else's tool. They have no skills of their own. And that's something that I hear a lot, so that's why it's in here. And I'd like you to sort of think about this and see, maybe which statement you agree with. So that out of the way, let's talk about detection rules. Specifically, I looked at some systems, but we'll start with one that I actually don't know which piece of software this is, what the detection rules are, but we'll start up with the infamous Argle-Bargle-Glock-Glyph attack. You all know this one, right? No one knows this one? it is a problem, and it's a real attack, because there's this GitHub issues that have been created about how their enterprise or corporate security firewall over goes crazy when a unit test contains this string. And I didn't find this. Somebody sent this to me because they had done a little bit of digging around, and they attributed to me having put this into one of my htaccess shells. Specifically, this one tries to cause a denial of service in Apache by making the Apache htaccess parser fail on something that is not valid Apache syntax. It could literally be anything. I picked Eigle Beigel Glop Glyph because when I was young and I played text adventures, this is what you would get back if you entered an invalid command. And I'm putting in invalid syntax. To me, it made sense. And then someone on some defensive rule writing team has gone, right, there's a denial of service condition, we're going to block this string. Maybe not Googling what it meant first, I don't know. But I have now changed this file because I want people to be able to use these strings in their unit tests without getting flagged by security. So yeah, the famous Eigle Beigel Glop. Right. Rule analysis. How many here look at YARA rules before running exploits on the red teams? Can't see any hands? No, didn't think so. It's actually really good. You should do it. So this is a Sigma rule for detecting exploitation against Fortinet SSL VPN. Because, like I said, recently a lot of security software has been flagged with having vulnerabilities. And we can see in the highlighted section, it's looking for basically two URI components, and they have to be in here. Like, it has to match both, because you can see it contains all. And then there are two specific strings. Now, if we make one of these strings not match, there is no detection. So again, by the power of... All right. Yeah, just put some slashes in there. Now you're APT. There's no detection. You just cruise right through, because they didn't patch that, because they had virtual patching and everything is fine. Right? You got something protecting your endpoint, please patch it immediately. Not just sort of this one. But is this a one-off case? Totally not. Here's another rule. In this case, it's Vsphere, which isn't strictly a security product, although some people use it to contain legacy systems in a VM, whatever. Again, very simple string, add some slashes, bypass the detection. Okay, yeah, all right, that's Sigma, and we have a couple of examples. Obviously, things like malware are in a very different category. Like web-based attacks are largely string-based, and so that makes the detection kind of dependent on string matching and difficult. But I would like to think that you could write better rules. Here's a great example. This is NSA Cyber Detection for web shells, and they've got my handle there on the line. And again, it comes back to this htaccess shell project where someone, NSA just incorporated this rule from someone else, but they went, I don't like this htaccess thing. YARA Rule is in one of the comments, so let's block that. Unfortunately, if you actually go on Google and you search htaccess-based web shell, you will find a lot of like Russian sites and stuff that don't have my name in it. So I think at this point we're like pandering to the lowest percentage of actors that would use this attack. It also doesn't stop the more traditional htaccess-based attacks where you make a GIF file execute as if it's PHP. Just overall, I think this detection is pretty poor. So I actually asked, I said, hey, you know, I'm just a security researcher, like I'm not some malware author, you know, you reckon you could maybe write a better rule and take my name off it? And they're like, no, it's in there because, you know, most non-state actors are so bad, and they just use the tools the way they are. And so, by leaving your name in the detection rule, anyone who uses your tool are going to get detected. And it just brings me this sort of full circle to this, okay, well, if that's our target, right? Like if you're writing rules for detection and your target is the bottom 50, 60, whatever many percent, you're basically just giving a free pass to anyone above that line. If you wrote a proper detection tool, it would get the top percentage as well as all the other junk, right? Because the other people don't modify the files anyway, so they're easy to detect. But yeah, so far no luck. I'm still on the repo. All right, here's another YARA rule, and this is for detecting Backdoor and Catalina. And I included this because it highlights one of the real problems with sort of string matching. Is it's looking for a file that starts with XML, less than 300 kilobytes in size. It has the service name Catalina. It has a connector port defined, right? Those are like the three things it's looking for as indicators. And then it'll skip if there's a false positive entry. And the first false positive entry is the connector string, but with a XML, HTML comment in front. And of course, because the matching will always match as close as possible, so when you're looking for connector, it doesn't have context. It doesn't realize the connector is inside a comment, so you kind of have to avoid this. But it leaves us in a nice position where we can define our XML file, say service Catalina, have our connector, and then on the line below, have our connector in comment. Because the execution, the Tomcat parsing the XML file, will accept the connector and then ignore the commented one. So now we bypass the rules and we still have an effective backdoor. And I don't know if it's a case of we believe that attackers aren't good and they're not going to evolve their game. We didn't have time to write proper rules. We just needed something that worked most of the time. I'm not entirely sure. Here's one from a local group. A bit of guidance on, what was that? F5 traffic management interface. And again, hard-coded string, add some slashes, no detection. And also across the pond, the UK variant have IOC detection for this, I can't remember, it's another security software. And you grab your access log, add some slashes, regex don't match. There's no indicators of compromise anymore. By the power of better. All right, that's kind of it. Conclusion, I'm using somebody else's words for the conclusion, so I'll get to that in a minute. But first, so there's basically two new tools, an update to an existing tool, and I will push it on the GitHub this afternoon. So you can find that on my GitHub YARA. And a smarter man than me, Halvar Fleck, he said this many years ago that specifically huge revenues are generated in our industry with appliances that only work as long as the attacker has not looked at them. And that very much is what I find to be true. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy security software, you shouldn't implement it. It's not in my slide deck, but John Strand said something on Twitter yesterday, and he said, don't laugh at defenses just because they can be bypassed. The idea is to have overlapping defenses so that where one sort of fails, another one picks up the problem. And then, of course, your ability to detect, combined with the speed of which you can respond, is actually where your core capability is. It's not the blinky box that says, I'm going to stop 100% of security with AI on the blockchain, or whatever the sales guy tells you, right? Yeah, so that's the conclusion. Hackers don't care. They don't care about your whatever, right? KiwiCon 3 representing yeah, that's really it. You know, maybe I should add in conclusion that the one thing I've found is if instead of relying on security solutions from preventing any incidents from occurring, is if you expect that at some point the security solutions will fail and the thing they're trying to protect gets compromised. If you expect that, quite often I find that people start engineering the networks different. We don't necessarily need, you know, an antivirus solution or a content disarming solution here. Maybe we'll just spin up an immutable VM that converts what's on the screen to a GIF and then puts it in an S3 bucket, kills the VM, and you know, through things like isolation and access control. Firewalls are actually not in here because when they're managed well, they actually do a decent job. So there are other ways of dealing with this rather than just sort of throwing the money at a solution, because I remember seeing some screenshots of an antivirus vendor, which shall remain nameless, where the sales guy promised, black and white in writing, that if you buy this solution, it will keep you safe, from 100% safe from all hacking and social engineering attempts for all of the future. Sure. So that's it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for that talk, Eldar. We have some questions on the Slack, and just so everyone knows, go on the Slack and ask some questions if you would like to ask Eldar something, and our other speakers as well. The first question by Theos is, why is URL normalization not more common?
URL what?
Normalization.
Good question, I don't know. It should be. I mean, the first load balancer problem would not have happened if, you know, normalization or canonicalization had happened. So, yeah, no, it should be. I don't know why.
That's good. Next question by Pacifist is, it's a question, doesn't trying to make actually secure WAF policy end up taking more work in terms of re-implementing app input sanitization? Surely that takes more work than just fixing the actual app itself. Is that true?
Possibly, but it can be done by someone who's not on the development team, potentially. So, you know, the financial incentives might be different.
And we have another question by Zephyr Junction. Do you know of any WAF systems that use regexes for their file paths rather than hard-coded strings? It seems like it would raise the bar significantly.
Regexes are hard. You might end up introducing a denial of service. All of the WAFs that I'm aware of supports it, and you could end up doing it. I think a large reason, and I'm not a WAF person, but my guess would be that processing regex is costly and can lead to denial of service conditions. It's better to write a specific rule.
And we've got one more question by Urban Adventurer. It's quite a long question. But he asks, and he starts off by saying, to fix the slash trick, it will require matching one or more slashes and passing file paths with dots and slashes. That means moving from string matching to regular expressions, and this will increase CPU usage. So my question is, the Urban Adventurer's question, is it worth accepting the risk of a WAF denial of service through increased CPU utilization?
I think I just answered that before, but I should add that if you do path normalization, you don't have to go to the regex solution. You can just normalize the path down to what it actually should be and then match it, which would be the better solution.
Well, that's all the questions we have for. Let's thank Eldar one more time for his talk.
By the power of slash.